Plus, their economy was in ruins, so they honestly didn't have any money to spend on an army anyway.
Yeah, but weren't they on less than friendly terms with Nicaragua?
Yeah, and in fact, Nicaragua did end up invading. But the Civil Guard fought back and the OAS brokered a ceasefire. The US and the rest of the OAS had their back, and they used it to full advantage. For a quarter century, they survived in the powder keg of Central America. That must have taken some serious diplomacy, even if the Civil Guard is pretty decked out for a police force.
Must be tough to be a country without an army.
Hey, Snake, mind if I ask you something?
Since when did you start asking permission?
So, you used to be part of a CIA paramilitary unit, right?
That's right.
Ever do any ops in Central America?
No, not personally. But there were other units who did all kinds of stuff.
I remember the Bay of Pigs invasion back in '61. The papers had a field day with it.
Operation Zapata. That was the CIA code name. The whole thing went south.
Then there was Che Guevara, being hunted down in Bolivia. I heard the CIA had a hand in that, too.
There were several units similar to mine. MSP, SOG. They'd recruit former special forces, train them as intelligence agents, and send them on deniable covert paramilitary operations. One of those units trained the Bolivian army in counter-guerrilla tactics.
And then had them shoot El Che.
So the story goes.
Around here they say La CIA instead of CIA, huh?
Nothing strange about it. That's how it's pronounced when you read it in Spanish.
It has the feminine noun ending a, so they use the article la. Apparently some people have taken to using the term UCLA.
That's a new one to me. What's it mean?
It stands for Unilaterally Controlled Latino Assets.
Meaning they're local agents?
Yeah, that's the idea. Washington uses them like pawns. Nobody knows who they really are or what they're doing.
You were saying Japan has a peace constitution too.
Yep. Japan renounced war in Article 9 of its constitution, aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order. The Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation, and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized.
You know it by heart.
Some things you never forget.
Impressive. There were some parts I didn't quite get, though. Like the whole means of settling conflicts thing.
Yeah, that's been the subject of debate. Whether or not it forbids any and all use of force. The current Constitution was originally drawn up under the Allied occupation. The first draft was even submitted by Allied GHQ. So naturally, there are some who feel the Constitution was imposed on Japan by foreigners.
Things like that are never simple. Same for every country, I guess.
One thing's for sure, though. Not having an army let Japan focus on economic recovery after the war. In that sense, it's the same as Costa Rica.
Kaz, you were in the Japanese Self-Defense Force, right? I thought that Article 9 you were talking about earlier prevented Japan from having an army.
Yeah, and that's another subject of controversy. The Self-Defense Force is an organization for the purpose of defense. Article 9 of the Constitution does not deny Japan's right to self-defense. Therefore, the SDF is constitutional. That's Tokyo's official stance.
Sounds complicated.
Call it what you will. It's a distinctly Japanese way of interpreting things.
The U.S. has military forces stationed in Japan, right?
Right. Even though the Allied occupation ended, American forces are still stationed there under the USJapan Security Treaty.
Unlike Costa Rica.
Part of it stems from the occupation. But Japan also occupies a key strategic position from America's perspective. It's next door to the Soviet Union and close to China and North Korea as well. It's integral to the security of Pacific Asia. For America, Japan represents a barrier against communism.
What about for Japan?
As you might expect, there's deep-rooted opposition to the alliance. In 1960 and 1970, when the treaty was up for revision, there were mass protest movements against it, especially in Okinawa. The U.S. only gave it back to Japan 2 years ago, and American bases are still concentrated there. It's a heavy burden for the Okinawans to bear.
Then why don't they scrap the treaty?
Lots of reasons. There's the imbalance of power with the U.S., of course, and if Japan pulled out, they'd be losing the nuclear umbrella America provides. And as for whether the JSDF could defend the country after the Americans left, I really couldn't say. Costa Rica is in a similar situation. They depend on the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, the so-called Rio Pact.
So, the countries with peace constitutions end up having to rely on other countries' armies. Kind of ironic.
On the flip side, not everybody in America is satisfied with it either. Some people argue Japan is freeloading off America's security guarantee. And you know how Japan's industrial exports are making inroads in the States.
Yeah, I've got a Japanese camera myself. Best damn camera around.
Japan's low defense spending allows it to invest more in economic recovery and expand its share of the American market. That's a bitter pill for Americans to swallow. You know that today, Japan is under the American nuclear umbrella.
Right.
The U.S. vowed to retaliate against any country that launches a nuclear strike against an allied country. That promise deters nuclear attacks against America's allies, hence the term nuclear umbrella. But suppose the Russians nuke Tokyo. Would America really nuke Moscow in return? If they did, the Soviet Union would undoubtedly retaliate. Would Washington really be willing to risk having a bomb dropped on itself in order to avenge Japan? I'm not so sure.
Don't tell me you're still worried about Japan. After all these years?
It's not that.
To be honest, I'm not convinced either. But Moscow faces the same dilemma. Maybe Washington wouldn't retaliate on Japan's behalf. Then again, maybe it would.
So you're saying Moscow wouldn't want to risk being attacked either?
The whole concept of nuclear deterrence is entirely hypothetical to begin with. When you get down to it, it's all smoke and mirrors.
Japan shall not possess, manufacture, or allow the introduction of nuclear weapons into Japan. Those are the 3 non-nuclear principles set forth by the Japanese government.
Allow the introduction? That's funny. Some of the U.S. warships that visit Japanese ports are armed with nukes. Or are you going to tell me they transfer them at sea onto other ships every time they visit?
You raise a good point, Snake. But the Japanese government doesn't recognize it as such. The introduction of nuclear weapons into Japanese territory would need to be agreed upon in advance. America hasn't made any such agreements. Therefore, they aren't bringing nukes into Japan. That's the official excuse.
Doesn't sound like much of an excuse to me.
I don't blame you. Keep in mind, though, Japan suffered actual nuclear attacks. Anti-nuke sentiment there runs deeper than you think. I suppose the government's not really in a position to admit that sort of thing.
So tell me, Kaz, how's the Self-Defense Force you were in different from an army?
The JSDF is set up for national defense. It's not configured for aggression against other countries. It's what you'd call exclusive defense.
Exclusive defense?
It's the fundamental strategic posture of the JSDF. No preemptive attacks. Only the minimum defensive action necessary after an enemy attacks.
Anything defined as self-defense, then?
The JSDF originated as the National Police Reserve. Back then, American forces stationed in Japan were being sent over to fight in the Korean War. So in a sense, the NPR was filling a gap.
Police, huh? Reminds me of the Costa Rican Civil Guard.
Yeah, exactly. They're also dispatched to provide disaster relief. The year before I joined, they had a hell of a time trying to rescue some buses that got hit by landslides.
So why'd you quit the JSDF?
Because I didn't have a reason to be in Japan anymore.
A reason?
My mom had died 3 years earlier, so I didn't have to care for her anymore. With her gone, there was no point hanging around in Japan.
Yeah, but a man with your talents could have risen pretty high in the ranks, I imagine.
I don't know what they made of me. Could be it actually alienated me from the brass. And personally, I could never get used to the idea of exclusive defense.
Meaning?
On a strategic level, I can see how a country could go with the exclusive defense model used by the JSDF, and I've got nothing against my fellow soldiers who believe in it. On a tactical level, though, it just rubbed me the wrong way. To put it simply, I was itching for a real fight.
I figured.
And I felt as long as I was in the JSDF, I'd never be able to stand shoulder to shoulder with my father, who was in the US Army. Seeing Yukio Mishima's suicide didn't help either.
Yukio Mishima, the guy who wrote The Temple of the Golden Pavilion.
The way he questioned the status quo hit home with me. Not that I admired his vision or anything, but it did get me thinking, that's for sure. Don't forget to give the MSF staff assignments. Where you place people will determine how Mother Base grows.
Right.
That goes for me too. Assign me wherever you think is best.
You? I thought you were second in command.
Life's funny sometimes, isn't it?
What brought that on?
We first met as enemies on the battlefield. And now here we are fighting side by side.
You mean Colombia?
Yeah. After I quit the JSDF, I made my way there and got myself a position as a drill sergeant for a band of revolutionaries, despite the fact that I'd never seen a day of combat.
I see you had the gift for talking business in Spanish even back then.
Oh, come on, stop it. You're making me blush. Unlucky for me, though, you were in the service of the Colombian Army. I remember it like it was yesterday. It all happened in an instant. You guys ambushed us, and half my unit was taken out. My mind went totally blank. I couldn't keep it together. My whole unit was wiped out, and I was left half dead from a bomb blast.
Then, as I was leaving, you yelled out at me. I came all the way from Japan to be here. My place is on the battlefield. Then you asked for my help, saying, I want to be the one to end it. I remember being surprised that there were still samurai in Japan.
You guys came over to me. I had a grenade hidden under me, but even then you were too fast. The second I pulled the pin, you grabbed the hand I was using to hold the grenade with both palms.
I didn't want it to go off. I'd heard samurai were a proud bunch. I wanted to know why one of them would stoop so low as to try to take his opponent with him.
And I said, I'll never lose again. We'll never lose again.
Yeah. We'll do whatever it takes, but we'll never be beaten again.
Then, I passed out from the blood loss. When I woke up, I was in your camp's infirmary, stuck full of tubes. Why'd you save me? Your enemy after I tried to kill you.
Because you swallowed your pride and fought with everything you had.
I just didn't want to lose.
You found a way to fight back, even in the face of death, even when you knew you were going to die. That's the mark of a true warrior. It's not about gain and loss, or victory and defeat. I looked at the way you lived your life and saw the path I needed to take. As a warrior.
Wow. I never knew that. And that's why